Now we're going to talk about one of my favorite categories of all, and that is Scotch whiskey. You know, I think about Scotch really as the world whiskey. Talking about whiskey all around the world, traveling all over the world. When people ask for whiskey, they're usually talking about Scotch. When a guy goes into a bar or a woman goes into a bar and asks for a whiskey, usually they're talking about Scotch whiskey. Now, how could that be? How could Scotch be the world whiskey when it comes from just a small country in the north of Great Britain with only 5 million people? What's the history of Scotch? How did it get to be the world whiskey? Well, the first recording of Scotch as a product that was actually being made on a grand scale was in 1494. Now, I personally think that distilling in Scotland had gone on since probably the 1300s. Now, we're talking about single malts and we're talking about grain whiskeys. And sometimes they come together in blends, but the distillate that's being made in Scotland right now is the finest distillate being made on the planet. The Irish were very good at making ale. And then once they got the workings of distillation, and once they got the stills, and again through the monks, they started making whiskey. And I think right now whiskey was being made probably even as early as 1100 in Ireland. But the Scots didn't really get it until the Irish monks came from Ireland, crossed the Irish Sea, and landed on the Mull of Kintyre in Argyll, and they brought stills with them because they wanted to convert the savage Scots who were just out of their minds, you know, running around in skirts. I mean, you know, come on. They wanted to convert the Scots from their pagan beliefs to Christianity. And so they took their stills with them. They took their beer making process, they took their stills with them. Now, that first recording of Scotch whiskey's existence really happened in 1494. Now, what happened was on an exchequer roll, with the government was looking for different purchases of wheat and barley and oats, the exchequer roll says, Friar John Core buys 8 balls of malt for the making of aquavitae. Now, we know from earlier in our module that aquavitae is the Latin for water of life. The Scots were making whiskey as early as the 1300s. And I think probably in Western Scotland and Argyll in particular, there was a lot of distillation going on. Now, bear in mind, of course, it was all pot still distillation, of course, because we know that until the mid-19th century, column stills were not, that technology hadn't been developed yet. So everything was on a very small scale, that most of the stills were very, very tiny, 5, maybe 10 gallons. That was it. So there was not a lot of whiskey being made, but what was being made was really being enjoyed because the Scots were growing a lot of barley. Barley is the key. So we have the situation, 1300s, 1400s, 1400s things are really starting to pick up. This elixir is really getting around. Of course, it's unaged at the time, so people would just bring their jug, their ceramic jug, draw off some spirit right off the still, no reduction. So, I mean, it was fire water. This is very, very strong stuff, but through the 1400s, in particular 1500s, they were getting much more sophisticated because the stills were getting larger. And when you're having a little bit larger stills, up to 50, 60 gallons, first of all, you're producing more product, but you have a little bit more control over it. The first actual bona fide recording of the existence of whiskey in Scotland was in 1494. During the 16th century, production just soared. So, here's the deal on this. Communities, families would own one still. 4 or 5 families within a village would own one still. And they would keep that still working all the time. One family would have it for 1 week. It would be their responsibility to produce all the spirit for that week, while the other families were out tending sheep, tending cattle, farming, and they would rotate. During the 18th century and 19th century, as the British Empire expanded around the globe, they took Scotch whiskey with them. England and Scotland merged into one country, making Great Britain. The British at the time were in the 100 Years' War with the French. And of course, you need money. Parliament's going, we've got all these wars, we're trying to expand the empire. We need money. So let's tax something that is a commodity. Let's tax something that everybody is using. So let's tax something that everybody's enjoying, that's in wide use all across Great Britain. Hey, wait a minute. Let's tax distillation. So that brings up the era of smuggling. And when we're talking about smuggling in the sense of Scotland, we're talking about the production, the illegal production of whiskey, as well as the transportation of it. So a lot of these distillers, virtually all of them, and we're talking about hundreds and hundreds of people, families, said, screw you to Parliament. We're going to illegally distill and just take our chances. So all during that period, during the 18th century, excisemen were sent out from Parliament all over Scotland. Now, if you've been to Scotland, you know, I mean, it's remote up there. And so it was quite easy to be moving a still around. Another reason why the Scots didn't like to have large stills was because large stills were it's too hard to move around. If you're trying, if the exciseman is snapping at your heels, you got to be able to move that still quickly. And with the increase of more excisemen going out into the field, shutting down people, arresting people, families would be incarcerated for years because of illegal use and abuse of the laws of Parliament. And a lot of people did shut down. So it became a process of diminishing returns. And finally, Parliament got the idea that maybe it was a good idea to pass some legislation for legal licensing of the stills, and that would kind of undercut this whole black market industry. So in 1823, a really crucial act was passed, and that was the act that made licensing of distillation and distilleries, owning a still, much easier to get. It was much easier to become legitimate at that point. So that really undercut a lot of the smugglers. So what we have is the makings of a cottage industry. Now, all throughout the Highlands and Islands of Scotland, Scotch whisky was being made. And oftentimes, an entire community would take part. They would take part in the stewardship of one particular small still. Now, these stills at the time were only 40 to 50 gallons in volume. So there was very, very limited possibility in terms of what was available. So really, only up until the mid-19th century, Scotch was very much a homegrown and home-appreciated product of Scotland. Now let's for a moment look at the two types of whiskies. In Scotland, there are two different styles of Scotch whisky. One is single malt. Single malt is 100% barley malt made in a pot still from one distillery. 100% very intense. Again, keep in mind, because it was a pot still, it's very intense, very, very flavorful, full of character. Second type of Scotch whisky is grain whisky, and that is all continuous still, corn or wheat, made in huge volumes, much, much larger volumes than single malt. In fact, at the moment, 96% of all Scotch whisky made is grain whisky, made from continuous stills. All the barley is malted. And I'm going to go through the malting and what that means in a sec. From one distillery, and it is all pot still. 100% barley, one distillery, all pot still. I'm of the mind now that from 12 to 20 years, that's the prime time for single malts. Blended Scotch whisky. Blended Scotch whisky, which is by overwhelming margins, the most common form of Scotch whisky, is a combination of single malts from pot stills, 100% barley, and combined, married with grain whiskeys. Now, oftentimes, the typical ratio of an average blended Scotch would be like about 35% malt, single malt whiskey, and 65% grain whiskey. Third important classification is blended malt whiskey. Blended malts are 2 or more single malt whiskeys from different distilleries put together. It is all barley malt. It is all pot still, but it's from 2 or more distilleries. Now, time was when this was called vatted malt. But do you see the name thing here? Drives me wild. Barrels, Jim Cryle, my friend at the Glenlivet, has told me that the influence of the barrel, the type of barrel, whether it's old sherry casks from Jerez de la Frontera, Spain, whether it's old bourbon casks from Kentucky or sometimes Tennessee sour mash from Tennessee, influences the taste of Scotch whiskey up to 70%. Up to 70%. So choosing good barrels, choosing good cooperage, choosing barrels that have not been worn out by use is really important. One of the things we're most interested in is how to look at single malt Scotch. This is a very high-end product. And yet, in a way, looking at the different regions of Scotland and how those regions affect the characteristics of single malts has become a little bit overplayed in our opinion. For a while, there were 4 classic single malt regions. And then, partially through my own fault, through writings that I had done, that was expanded to 8 to 9 different regions. And I think in the meantime, some of that has become a little bit too specialized. Some of it has become a little bit too snobby. So lately, we've been thinking that perhaps there's another way to look at single malt Scotch whiskey and, by extension, blended malts themselves. And, by extension, blended Scotches themselves. And that's thinking this way. Scotland is surrounded by water. Many of the whiskeys that are made for Scotch whiskey are made in highlands that are up to 50 miles from the ocean, but also very many of them are made on the coast or on an island. So now we're looking at possibly looking at Scotch whiskey this way. Is it maritime influenced or is it inland influenced? If it's maritime influenced, it'll be a little bit salty. Now remember, in your tasting earlier on with Steve and Doug, and they were talking about Chivas Regal, and they said, you know, there's a little bit of salt to this. There's a little bit of brininess. And that's absolutely right, as it should be. There's a little bit of single malt from a coast that went into the making of Chivas Regal. So that influence from the seaside absolutely is apparent. And yet, for a single malt or a blend that is only comprised of whiskeys from the inlands, they'll taste a little bit flowery. They'll taste a little bit fruity. No saltiness, no brininess probably whatsoever. So you're looking at 2 very, very distinct ways of trying to discern where did that whiskey come from. And learning where it came from certainly adds some luster to your talking about it to a customer across the bar. The more you know and the more stories you can tell, the more you can sell. And today we're looking at a tremendous market of wide tastes, variances in textures and aromas and flavors that we've never seen before, different types of woods. And the important thing is, all of these are made from this small country on the north of Great Britain that only has 5 million people. That's the story of Scotch whiskey, and that's what you should know.